Good afternoon. I'm Gray Sasser, the Executive Director of the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy. With the midterms looming, voters have the economy on their minds. According to the latest Pew Research survey results, more than 3/4 of registered voters say the economy is very important in how they will cast their ballots. Given the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy's goal to elevate facts and reason into the national dialogue, I'm really excited today to welcome Dr. Mark Zandi to this conversation, who will help us cut through some of the clutter and competing numbers and actually answer some of our followers' questions on the economy. Real quick, let me give you Mark's CV. If I spent all day doing this, Mark, we wouldn't have time to talk about anything else. But real quick, Mark earned his BS from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, went on to get his PhD at University of Pennsylvania, regularly testifies before Congress, regular guest on NPR, Meet the Press, CNBC, CNN, and many other national news programs. And the real reason I'm so excited to talk to him today is Dr. Mark Zandi's got the unique ability to talk about economics without putting us all to sleep. So thanks so much, Mark. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Gray. It's really a pleasure and honor to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, we appreciate it. So we went out to the folks who've been following us, what we've been doing down here, and solicited questions. And as you can imagine, the number one hot topic was inflation. One of the questions we got is the inflation of 2022 different than the inflation of the 1970s? There's something different that's causing this. Is it supply chain, what's going on in China, what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, or is this a repeat of past American history?
Well, there's a lot of similarities between the inflation today and the high inflation of the 70s and 80s. First, the inflation is primarily the result of a shock to the supply side of the economy. You know, back in the 70s and 80s, it was oil prices due to embargoes on related to oil. You know, the Iranian Revolution back in 1980 and the oil embargo of 1973. This go around, it's the pandemic. You know, obviously that's a big supply shock. It disrupted the global supply chains, caused shortages and prices to jump for everything from vehicles to appliances. Disrupted the labor market. You've got a lot of folks that were pushed out of the labor market and are coming back, but slowly. So it really affected immigration. Foreign immigration collapsed during the pandemic. Lots of other things going on there as well, obviously. But that has had big impacts on the labor market and labor supply. And then, of course, the other supply shock is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was on no one's radar screen a year ago, but obviously caused oil prices, natural gas, agricultural prices, metals prices to jump. So there's a lot of similarity there. The difference, the structure of the economy is different today than then. Back then, there were a lot of COLAs, cost of living adjustments, and labor contracts. So inflation went up and wages went up and wages went up, inflation went up. So you got into this kind of self-reinforcing wage price spiral that resulted in the so-called stagflation of that time, high inflation, high unemployment. We don't have that same kind of structure of the labor market today. All those COLAs got kind of wrung out in the period after that. And so there's a lot of differences as well. The last thing I'll say is, while inflation is high today, uncomfortably high, painfully high, it's not nearly as high as was back in the 70s and 80s. Back then, there were times when inflation was twice what it is currently.
So with inflation going up, the Fed is always in a position to try to move the interest rates up and stop the inflation in its tracks. But are there other tools available out there besides just higher interest rates that policymakers could take advantage of to tamp down on inflation?
Yeah, sure. On the fiscal policy side, but obviously the job number one for the Federal Reserve is stable prices, inflation. So that's their, one of their key objectives, along with full employment. So that's the policy's number one approach to addressing high inflation is through interest rates and monetary policy. But having said that, I do think there's things that fiscal policymakers can do, although, obviously it's pretty tough in this political environment, particularly the environment that probably will prevail on either side of the midterm elections with a divided government, which seems more likely than not. Hard to get legislation through. But if I were king for the day, might need a week, Gray, but if I
we'll give you two if you need it.
Okay, fair enough. I'd focus on housing, because the sources of the inflation that is very serious and going to be very persistent because we lack affordable housing. Vacancy rates across the housing stock are close to record lows, and rent growth has gone skyward here, double-digit kind of rent growth. So if if you've got a child moving into an apartment to go back to school, it. I mean, the rents you're paying are incredibly high. And even, if you're renewing your lease and you see what the landlord wants, in many markets it's 10, 15, 20% up, then, that's really, problem. The 1/3 of all our budgets nation, if you look across all consumers, is, roughly goes to housing in one form or another. So it's a big deal. So I focus on trying to get more supply to try to get rent growth down and get prices more affordable. So things like LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits, new market tax credits, the new neighborhood home tax credit. I'm throwing those things out very quickly because, that might have some bipartisan support.
Yeah.
I think Republicans and Democrats can kind of coalesce around, those kind of tax expenditures because they feel like a tax cut and they feel like spending, and that satisfies both parties. And, also it could help the housing market out pretty quickly, not next month, but by this time next year.
Right. And so with it, this climate of rising inflation, employment, I think ticked up just slightly last month, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But people are throwing around the word recession. Are we in one now, or is one coming up? And we've got several questions here about, is a recession just right around the corner in 2023? And I'm not going to ask you to make too many predictions, but if you could give us your insight on what the chances of that happening, and then if you think a recession is going to, if what could be one of the geopolitical events that could cause you to change your view outside of another, Russia deciding to invade Azerbaijan or something?
Yeah, well, first let me say we're not in recession. There's been a lot of debate about that because GDP fell in the first half of the year, but that's kind of just a rule of thumb and not consistent with the fact that the job market is just rip roaring. We're creating hundreds of thousands of jobs every month. Unemployment is low. The number of unfilled open job positions pretty close to a record high. Layoffs are at record lows. I mean, there's been some announced layoffs by certain companies, Tesla, Goldman Sachs, but economy-wide, they're about as low as they get. People are quitting their jobs at a very high rate. That's starting to come down a little bit, but it's incredibly elevated. You don't quit your job unless you're pretty confident you can find another one. Does that sound like a recession to you? It doesn't to me.
Not quite yet.
No. Now, what about recession risks down the road? I don't think, in the next 3-6 months, it's very likely something really bad would have to happen, something really go off the rails. But, if you look out over the next 12-18, recession risks are high because inflation is high. The Federal Reserve is on the warpath, raising interest rates very aggressively to try to slow that job growth down, get wage growth to moderate, to get inflation in. And, when you're in that environment of high inflation, high interest rates, rising interest rates, recession risks are high. And I put, the probability of going into, a real recession, job loss, rising unemployment in the next 12-18 months at probably even odds. It's, pretty close one way or the other. The thing I'd say to your question is, even if we're not going into recession, it's going to feel uncomfortable. And in that, because, we're going to come to close to a standstill, unemployment probably will start to notch higher. In that kind of environment, if anything else does go wrong, they're the known unknowns, the pandemic and the Russian invasion, they could go off the rails again. Who knows? I'm assuming they won't, but who knows? And then, of course, there's the unknown unknowns, right? I mean, that rail strike that we nearly dodged, that, that came out of nowhere, at least from my radar screen. And I had this nightmare about a Cat 5 hurricane blowing through the Gulf and hitting the Texas coast and wiping out a refinery, and there's no refining capacity. So gas prices go back up to their record highs. And if that happens, because everything is so fragile, and sentiment is so weak, that could cause us to all run into the bunker and go back into recession. So there's a lot of things that could, go off the rails here, even a little bit, that could push us in because the economy is going to struggle here over the next 12-18 months, even if we don't go into recession.
Yeah, and it occurs to me, even if I did make you king for a day, a week, or 2 weeks, you still couldn't block that hurricane coming up the Gulf Coast.
No, I could wish it.
But leads me to kind of think, the president or the party in power seems to get a whole lot of the blame if things aren't going well, or the credit or take the credit if gas prices are coming down and inflation's coming down. But are some of these factors really beyond the control of president and executive branch and the members of Congress? And are we thinking too much, or giving too much claim or attaching too much blame to some of the folks in office for these events that may or may not be able to be controlled by legislation?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot of what happens are things that are completely out of the control of anybody, right? I mean, the pandemic. I mean, we can debate and argue about the response, but at the end of the day, there's no avoiding that, and that was going to do tremendous damage one way or the other. The Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, how can you blame anyone for that? I mean, maybe you can connect the dots back to something someone did, but that's pretty tough to do. So yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to the idea that while presidents and politicians, policymakers get the blame or the credit depending on the things are going, it's overdone. Having said that, they are
Right.
important actors and they matter. So for example, in the current run up in oil prices, I do think when President Biden decided to release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, about a million barrels a day, that was important. It didn't stop oil prices from going higher, but it certainly limited those those increases, and has contributed to bringing prices back in. So, I talked about the what they could do about housing. That's another example. Or most importantly, though, I think policymakers, politicians, government is most important in times of crises when things are just going completely, off the rails. So when we're in the middle of the pandemic, that's when policymakers really matter. Or when we were in the financial crisis back, a little over a decade ago, that's when policymaking really matters. It's, when government has to be the backstop, for all of us. And that's fundamentally government's job, right? When things are completely off the rails, I keep using that as the metaphor because I think that works.
Well, we did avert a rail strike, so you're.
Yeah, and that must be why it's top of mind. I'll try to use a different metaphor next time I go to describe that. But it's very important for government to step into the breach when it's a big breach, when we're in times of crisis, because no one else can.
Well, you've touched on a lot of things, and one of the things you touched on was that it's hard right now for employers to find employees or employees to fill the jobs that are out there. This is it just my kind of overreaction? Did this problem exist prior to COVID, or is this something new that we're seeing right now? And number one, what's happening, and then number two, what's the solution?
Yeah, well, the labor market was actually quite tight. It's hard to remember back, but pre-pandemic, That was the number one problem businesses faced was low unemployment. I mean, the unemployment rate today is about where it was when it at its low in the pre-pandemic period back in late 2019, early 2020, about 3.5%. And businesses were, scrambling to find workers. And of course, the pandemic exacerbated all that because, it made people sick. It caused people to leave the labor force because they were fearful of getting sick. Their elderly parents or their child, might get sick. They couldn't get childcare. Still, these are all still issues, that are, affecting people's ability to go back to work. Long COVID is now an issue, that's making it more difficult for people to work or work the same hours that they were before. But the labor supply problems were in train before the pandemic, and there are going to be problems even on the other side of the pandemic. And it's just demographics. It's me and you, Gray, as baby boomers. I don't know. It doesn't look like you'll ever retire, Gray, but I think
I aspire to it one day.
Aspire to it one day. Exactly. So we're a big part of the labor force. The millennials are bigger, but they're already in the labor force. So that's going to weigh on labor supply. And then here's the key thing. I mentioned this earlier is immigration. We were at 1 million immigrants, I'm rounding obviously, before, if you go back into President Obama's term, because of change in policy under President Trump. And of course, the pandemic, we got down to a couple 100,000 last year. That's starting to improve now, but we need to get back to 1 million at least. I mean, that's key to skilled and unskilled. I mean, we need more immigrants to help power the economy, like was the case prior, because of the aging of our population and the boomers leaving. In fact, here's something to contemplate. If there's no immigration coming in the United States, the nation's working age population will decline. That's Japan. That's now China has that problem. Germany has that problem. So we need more immigrants, and that goes to the solution, we need more immigrants. We need a rational immigration policy to figure out how to, bring the, immigrants into our country. And again, we obviously skilled. So any like Vanderbilt, I mean, if anyone in my mind graduates from an accredited American university or college, they should get a visa stamped on their head. You stay. We want you because you're going to be helping to power the economy of the future. By the way, immigration is not only important in terms of labor supply; it's also important in terms of labor productivity, because immigrants tend to be they start companies at a higher rate. They're more risk taking. They're more entrepreneurial. By definition, because there's self-selection. You don't pick up and leave one country and come to another that's foreign to you if you're not a risk taker. So we need to really think about immigration policy. I know that's very vexed in the current political environment, but here's an intrepid forecast for you, Gray. My sense is that if I look out 5-10 years from now, given how tight the labor market's going to be, and how hard this is going to be on businesses who can't get labor, we're going to get a consensus that we need more immigration, and we're going to get some piece of legislation through, some future Congress and president. I mean, it may take 5-10 years to do it, but I suspect that will happen.
Could we ever get into a spot where you see, you're talking about Germany, China, Japan, where these countries that have the aging population that have almost reverse of today's narrative, where they want to start competing for those labor forces to come back into their country?
Possibly, but we're different, right? Because our nation was born out of immigrants, and this is part of our culture. It's only recently, in the last few years, where we've kind of forgotten that and gotten away from it. I think we're going to come back to it. There's too many of us that are immigrants, or I come from a second generation immigrant family, so I just think it's very different in the case of like a Japan or a Germany or a China. They just don't have that history or that culture. It's very difficult for them to do that. Now, Germany, under Angela Merkel, she let about 1 million Middle Eastern Syrian refugees come into the country. So she tried. I mean, that had a lot of unintended consequences that kind of backfired on her. But that just goes to the lack of history and culture in many of those other countries.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about numbers, and I got a great question from somebody wanting to know, kind of pull these numbers apart a little bit. We talk about the unemployment rate. You mentioned the labor participation rate, and can you kind of give us a little bit of the Econ 101? How does the labor participation rate fit back into that unemployment rate? Should we be looking at the unemployment, or is labor participation more important? And kind of same with inflation, Mark. We look at that, I guess it's called the headline number, and there's a lot of components that go into that inflation number, everything from the cost of gas to the cost of an apartment to what I'm paying at the grocery store. Are some of those components maybe more important as we want to maybe parse through just whatever the top line number is?
Yeah, well, on labor force participation and unemployment. So the number of people that are in the labor market looking for work or working is equal to the working age population. How many people are of working age times the participation rate of those working age people, right? So what percent of them are working? So we need, in terms of labor supply, in terms of people who are out there looking for work or working, we need more working age population that goes to immigration. And it would be nice to get higher labor force participation. So those people of working age, where they just participate in the labor market at a higher rate, they want to work, one way or the other. So both are important. That determines the supply of labor. And then you have the demand for labor. That's businesses, going out there and saying, hey, I need you to, I have an open position, please come fill that position. And the confluence of labor demand and supply result in the unemployment rate. What percent of the labor force is unemployed? So if you have limited supply, if labor force participation is low and strong demand, then you have a very low unemployment rate, a tight labor market. And that's kind of the environment that exists today. We want policies that bring in more work, because the labor market is so tight. And businesses are saying, I can't grow, I can't expand. That's restricting the ability of the economy to grow and improve our standard of living, improve our wealth and our incomes. We need more workers. So that means more immigrants, and we need policies that try to help lift participation. So, for example, child tax credit, it's a great example, because a lot of young parents can't go to work because they can't afford childcare. So, let's make it easier for them to pay for childcare so they can go to work. The earned income tax credit, there's policies that, or, I would even focus on, retirees, because one of the interesting things, Gray, is one of the real changes in the pandemic has not been the number of people retiring. That's been roughly equivalent to what it was pre-pandemic. What's different is the number of people that are retired coming back into the workforce. There's actually a lot of people that retire and they go, oh, I want to work, or I need to work because the stock market's down or house prices are down. And they come back into the workforce. And that's what's really depressed. So we need to really focus on that group, try to get them back into the labor force.
And are they coming back into the workplace because, as you say, the stock market's down, or is it more of a lifestyle decision? You retire and you realize you might want to be back in the workforce?
It's absolutely both. It's like, this is retirement thing. I thought it was going to be really cool, but, I'm actually not fulfilled. I'm bored. I want to do something else. I want to work. And then the other thing is, this retirement thing's okay. I kind of like it, but, if I want to live the lifestyle that I lived before retirement, I need to work. I misjudged, or my financial circumstances change. I mentioned the stock market, but it could be lots of other things that could, change a person's kind of financial situation.
I really appreciate you unpacking that employment labor participation rate. Can you kind of help us a little bit the same on the inflation side? So what are the big drivers of that, and how, and maybe speculate on how maybe one or two of them could affect that overall top line number?
Yeah, sure. So take consumer price inflation, CPI inflation. That's the inflation number that we all love and live by. 8.3%. That's year over year through the month of August. It should be no higher than 2.5%. That's what the Fed is targeting. That's what would be, I think, reasonably comfortable for folks and consistent with, a well-functioning economy. So we're about 6 percentage points. It's 8.3 minus 2.5. Let's round. Let's say it's 6 percentage
Thanks
points.
For rounding. That's helpful.
Yeah, make it easy. Of that, 2 percentage points is energy, high energy costs, the high oil costs. And again, I'm rounding. 1 percentage point is food, the acceleration food, which, by the way, a lot of that is energy, because you got to get the food from the farm and the ranch to the store shelf. That's diesel, and that's been very elevated. 1 percentage point is supply chain still. Vehicle prices is the poster child for that. New vehicle prices keep going north, and we've got to get them south when supply chains iron out. So that's 2 plus 1 plus 1. That's 4 percentage points.
Got 2 left.
6. The other 2 percentage points are above, the 2.5% target. Increasingly, our rents. We talked about rent growth, and that's going to become more of a deal going forward. That's probably about a point, maybe a little over a percentage point. So you got 1 point left, and that's a hodgepodge of things. The one thing I will call out there that's worrying me is medical care services inflation, and that goes to the labor market. Medical care services is prices are dependent on wages that you pay people in the healthcare sector, from nurses to doctors to the folks that clean the rooms and the technicians, and they're in very short supply, and they're completely burned out by the pandemic, completely washed out, and wages are rising very rapidly as a result, and that's putting upward pressure on medical care inflation, which is in that last percentage point. So of the 8.5, getting half of that down to where we need to go is going to be pretty straightforward, I think, if the pandemic and the Russian invasion just stick to script and don't cause any more problems. I know it's a big assumption, but just assuming that supply chains iron out, it's going to be the last percentage point, the last 1.5 that's going to be tough, because that goes to rent, medical care, things that are, a little bit more structural and, going to be a little more difficult to bring in. And that's why recession risks are as high as they are, because the Fed's going to bring that inflation rate in one way or the other. And they may have to push the economy into recession to get there, given the persistence of rent growth and medical care inflation.
Well, it's interesting when you unpack that inflation number, it brings us almost full circle to where one of the questions we were talking about earlier, where what impact can the executive legislative branch have with what's the Fed doing? The Fed can have this big push to bring it down, but then if you're looking for that last 1 or 2 or 0.5%, it comes back into what you were saying about the housing market or potentially an immigration or something. There are other mechanisms that can be used that aren't quite as blunt a tool.
Absolutely. No. And also, as you know, medical care inflation has been a problem for a long time. It's going to be a problem for a long time to come. So, we got to keep focusing on that sector of the economy. The Obamacare actually weighed on healthcare inflation for a good decade, but I think those days are over. And so we need to double down here and really think about how to improve productivity in the healthcare sector to keep inflation down.
Well, we're still talking about supply chains, even though I guess COVID is either over or depending on who you're listening to today. But what are some of the global trends that might help with those supply chain issues? We've heard a lot about reshoring, bringing some of the manufacturing back to the U.S. Is this whole notion of the world is becoming round again? It's no longer flat, that we're going to start to see maybe regional kind of economies rather than kind of a global econoany.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that.
Would that have any impact on future supply chain shocks?
Yeah, I like going back from the flat economy to the round economy. I hadn't heard that. That's a good way of putting it.
You can borrow that one, Mark.
Can I? I think I definitely. Well, even if you didn't give permission, Ray, I might have taken that, stolen that, but I would have told you. Yeah. So I'm sorry. So the thrust of the question is.
So if we're going from back where maybe some manufacturing is being reshored in the U.S. or maybe
supply chain
back from Asia into the North American, South America region. Number one, is that a true fact? And then number two, will that have any impact on future supply chain shocks?
Yeah, it will. But not for a while, right? Yeah. I mean, most immediately, the key is China's no COVID policy. They have this policy where they shut things down if they find one case. And of course, a lot of the supply chains, either originate in China or run through China. So if they shut down, then the supply chains get disrupted, and that's a problem for us. It just exacerbates shortages for different things and causes prices to jump. So that's our biggest near-term issue. But I do think all of this has made it clear that our supply chains are fragile and very vulnerable. Some of them, very important from a military perspective, a geopolitical perspective, like the chip industry. So, we do need to make those supply chains more resilient, bring them closer to home, particularly for those things that are strategically important, like chips. That goes to the CHIPS Act that was just passed, by Congress to try to help facilitate and support more development of chip manufacturing here in the U.S. But that's going to take a while. That's going to take some time. One encouraging thing is I do think businesses, seen religion here and do believe that their supply chains, that they took them for granted, that they were okay, but now they understand that they've got to invest more, and we're seeing a lot of investment in supply chain management and supply chain resilience, and I think that will serve us, going forward.
Yeah, but a lot of these things, they all take a little while to
they take time
back into the system.
Like the chips, to put up a fab plant, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's 4 or 5 years, so
yes,
it'll take a while.
Yeah, I'm going to trust you on the years. I just know it takes a long time.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about things taking a little while to move one way or the other. And I'm not going to get you into speculating about how gas prices are going to affect the Democratic Party or how inflation rate's going to affect the Republican Party. There's plenty of that out there. But is everything kind of baked in right now? We got a roughly 50 some odd days to the midterms. Are we fully baked, or is there something else that we could, another piece of an economic shoe to drop, so to speak, beyond I think you called you had a great phrase, the unknown unknowns. Is that it?
Yeah, the unknown unknowns. Things happen.
Can I quote you on that one?
Yeah, things happen when you least expect it. So are things baked? Probably not. I can imagine, if you look at the calendar of economic events, we're pretty close to getting baked. We've got another big job number coming in a couple of weeks for the month of September. We'll get one more inflation report. So those are the two big reports between now and Election Day. And they could change things. I mean, that CPI report we got last week, that certainly changed the dynamics, certainly financial markets. That's the other thing. Financial markets are fragile. They're going up and down and all around, and not inconceivable that the stock market, could head south in a big way. Could go north, but I think it do, have more political ramifications if it went south in a big way. So that could happen from an economic perspective. But from what could happen, lots of things could happen between now and then. So, and some good things too. I mean, take a look at what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. I mean, for the moment, that feels, pretty good. Putin, we'll have to see how Putin reacts to that and what he does. That could be a problem or not. But right now, for the moment, that seems to be moving in the right direction, and that might have some implications for the election, as it plays out over the next 50 days. So, but from an economic perspective, the one I'll just throw out the obvious, but let's just make it clear. The thing that matters most is just the cost of a gallon of gasoline, right? I mean, it's $3 nationwide, $3.75. It was $5 back in June at the peak. That's the all-time high. Typical good would be $2.75, maybe $3. So we're still high, but I think people feel pretty good about $3.75. It stays there. That's got to, help out the Democrats. It means that gas is not a headwind. Maybe it's a little bit of a tailwind, but it's not a headwind. But if it goes back up, I mentioned that, the possibility, then that becomes a raging headwind for the Democrats, pretty quickly.
Yeah, I appreciate all the time. We're kind of wrapping this thing up, but given the name of the project, we like to think about sometimes, issues that potentially could unify the country, maybe where we get some common sense policy that are beyond partisan. But before we get there, your talk on gas prices is interesting to me because that's a kind of a unifying statistic that it affects just about all Americans in some way, shape, or form. If we're not buying our gas, we're paying a little bit more to take the bus or an Uber. Are there any other kind of statistics like out there? I guess housing prices, but what are some of the other ones that kind of just cut across those socioeconomic classes that we have in the country that hit everybody?
Well, I mean, the stock market, of course, only half of Americans own stocks, but it's kind of a litmus test. It's kind of, a real-time report card on how the economy is doing. It doesn't have, because only half of Americans own any stock, it doesn't resonate with a lot of folks, but, it matters to, half the population in a significant way. House prices matter to 2/3 of the population. The home ownership rate's 2/3. So that matters. That house prices are rolling over. They're coming down. I don't know that that's going to have a big political impact in the next 50 days, just because you don't really know what your home is worth. You're still looking at Zillow to figure that out. And Zillow prices are still, pretty elevated. And most people don't want to need to sell or want to sell their home anyway. So I'm not sure that makes a difference in their thinking. But
maybe it has a difference in the way you think about how wealthy you could be, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe. Certainly on the margin. So that, that's not inconsequential. The thing I think really matters though is jobs. It's employment. Are we creating jobs? Do I have a job? Do my kids have a job? Do my friends and family have a job? And if I have a job, am I getting the hours I want? And if I'm getting the hours I want, am I getting the pay that I want, the pay increase that I want? Do I have opportunities for other jobs? I mean, at the end of the day, I think that's also really important to people. It's not quite as important at the moment because inflation is at the top of the list of concerns.
Yeah.
But if inflation wasn't there, we'd all be focused on jobs. That would be the thing we'd be focused on.
I mean, will we ever get to a point where we're not focused on one of these numbers? I guess somebody's called economics a dismal science. So are we always?
Well, I've been I've been a
spot?
professional economist for 30 plus years. There hasn't been a day when I've had that problem. So no, I wouldn't worry about that. I'm not worried about it. No, I think I got a job. As long as long as Moody's wants me, I have a job.
Well, listen, Mark, thank you so much for your time today. I could pepper you with questions all day long, but I know you've got a few other things to do, and I appreciate you explaining some economics to a history major like myself. So thanks so much.
Well, it was wonderful chatting with you. Great questions. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, they're not mine. I just have to stated.
I don't know. You kind of put it all together. I thought it was really well done.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully we talk again. And
Yeah,
by the
come
way,
again.
Gray, I strive to be 51% right. So just, your folks, listeners
Listen,
know.
if you 51% right, I'll go to Vegas with you, right?
Yeah, there you go. That's my point. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Take care now.
All right, bye-bye.